Welcome to lecture 48, which is on unsupervised classification methods. In this lecture, you will learn the other important method which is unsupervised, because in the previous lecture we covered the supervised method. So, this unsupervised method is more or less opposite in nature to the supervised classification approach and very popular classification methods in remote sensing. So, let us begin with this lecture. As you are aware now, there are broadly two types of classification methods: supervised classification method and unsupervised classification method. So, today we are dealing with the unsupervised classification methods. So, here analysis, you have to carry out the analysis, and then after carrying out the analysis independently with the analyst intervention, that once the classification is done, then the human intervention is more in the after the classification process to name those spectral classes into informational classes. In supervised method, it is reverse, as you might be aware now, that lot of input would be required from the analyst in terms of the training data sets to train the algorithm. So, if we broadly see the difference between the two techniques here, it is shown in this diagram here, that supervised classification method would require a lot of ground truth data. But unsupervised method, you are using certain kind of a decision rules. You decide how many classes are required at the end, and how many iterations would be required, and what will be the threshold value of the standard deviation to accept that. And once you do that, you require the data for accuracy assessment in both the classification methods. So, you do not require training data in the beginning in unsupervised classification method. You require some reference data so that you can check the classification accuracy. So, more broadly, if we look at the two techniques, supervised versus unsupervised techniques. Now, as far as the parameters are concerned, the supervised machine learning technique basically require input data, and algorithms are trained using that label data. Now, algorithms in the unsupervised method are used against the data which has not been labeled, which has not been designated into different classes. Now, if we start classification from them and see the computational complexity, supervised classification is a simpler method, but unsupervised learning is computationally complex, because you have to achieve the accuracy from there. So, as far as the accuracy level is concerned, we get highly accurate and trustworthy method, and unsupervised method is less accurate and trustworthy. So, the comparison between the two, as far as the input data requirement, computational complexity is required, and the accuracy which we achieve, these are very general guidelines. In fact, it would again depend upon the scene which we are classifying, the number of classes which we are going to identify, the homogeneity of the scene, what are the different spectral bands which we are using, which classification method we are adopting, then the training samples which we are using in a supervised classification method. So, it will all depend, their general guideline will depend upon many factors. Now, there are a large number of unsupervised classifiers which are available, and people have used them. So, this is called a clustering technique. Basically, it will cluster the group of pixels into one cluster and another group of pixels into the another cluster. And very popular cluster technique is the ISODATA technique, which lot of people have used it because of its simplicity. Then other techniques could be the k-means classifier. It could be the fuzzy k-means classifier, where the boundaries are fuzzy, or maybe the machine learning, which is the the latest topics nowadays when we are classifying the satellite images using machine learning and deep learning techniques. So, there are various methods which are available to us under the unsupervised classifier. We are not going to discuss all the methods in this lecture. So, we will discuss the ISODATA method, which is the most popular method. So, if we see broad steps which are involved in unsupervised learning, is the clustering. The group of pixels are clustered together and there might be several clusters in one single image. And then the association between those clusters, the relationship between those clusters. And the example is shown here with a normal image where we have images of the dogs and images of the cats in the raw data. This is unlabeled data and we are carrying out the interpretation of this data using unsupervised learning technique, and when we are doing that we carry out interpretation and carry out the processing of the data, and finally my output is that I am able to separate out the dogs together and separate out the cats together. So, this is clustering part and the another part is the association part. So, these two broad steps are involved. Once you get the output, then you have to label that output into the classes. So, if we look at now the detail of this unsupervised classification method, the user is defining how many number of classes would be required. So, if we have the satellite image and we want to identify 10 classes or we want to identify 8 classes, that is users dependent. So, we have to define them. Then algorithm on the basis of those number of classes which you want to identify, find pixels with the similar spectral property. So, here also the DN values are important, the signatures of those objects are spectral signatures are very important. Then the user must name those classes after the classification has been done, and maybe it is necessary that some of the classes are spectrally similar. So, we have to combine them together and to make one single class, information class, or maybe sometimes it is other way around, we have to split further together to make them two classes. So, the best thing in this unsupervised classification technique is that you do not require a prior knowledge of the ground, whereas in supervised method a prior knowledge is required because of the training inputs data which is. So, no prior information knowledge is required for the area which you are going to classify, and the unknown classes are there, spectral classes are generated. This is a exploratory method in the sense that we may identify 8 classes, we may identify 5 different classes or 10 different classes. So, it is the exploratory method that how you are going to precisely differentiate those mixed classes or the pure classes when you change this number. And then there are different algorithms available, as I told you. In the literature you find lots of algorithms are available under unsupervised classification technique. So, when you define the number of spectral classes, the software, the algorithm will identify the natural groupings within the multispectral data. So, if we define the 10 number of classes, the entire range of the DN values which are present on the satellite image will grouped into 10 different classes, spectral groups, natural groups, and pixels. They are grouped on the basis of the similarity of the irradiance values or the reflectances. So, there could be large number of pixels which have the similarity. So, that makes a cluster. So, group of pixels will make cluster. So, if we define 10 as our output classes we require from the satellite image. So, there could be 10 clusters now. The entire range will be divided into 10 clusters, and we will have the mean value, we will have the minimum value, we will have the maximum value, we will have the standard deviation of each of the cluster. So, analyst has to match now each of the cluster to the thematic class, when we assign the name to each of the class at the end. Now, this method is purely based on the spectral groupings and consider spectral distance measure, and it requires very minimal user interaction. So, user will come to know at the end the desired results. So, that is why the user interaction is very much minimum, and then after the classification has been done, it requires a lot of human knowledge in order to give the names to those classes. So, if we look at the graph here, we have the band data, single band data, which is plotted on the x axis, and the you can see the clusters of the values, and A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, they are the number of classes which we like to identify at the end. So, if we want to classify the whole scene into A, ranging from A to G number of classes, then this is the vertical lines are indicating the clusters. So, on the basis of the similarity of the pixels, a similar DN values will make cluster. So, this is like a initial clustering, and then this will keep on changing, the boundary will keep on shifting as the iterations will continue. So, this is a purely iterative based procedure. So, now we look at the two band data. So, if we plot this two band data, so you will get a kind of a scatter plot, and in that values, among those values, now you have those 10 classes you have identified. So, those 10 classes are making their clusters together, and see the separability also, whether the separability is being maintained or not. So, sigma of the value is very important. So, each of the class center, we have the mean value, then we have the sigma value, which is the variation within the cluster itself, and these are the class centers which are shown here. There are 5 class centers, that means these are the 5 distinct classes which one can identify from the images. So, this two band data is again plotted, and you can see the cluster of the data, and these clusters basically are black dot, big dot are indicating the mean values of the 5 classes. So, there are 5 clusters, and then there is a spread of the data within the within the range which we call as the spectral similarity range here. So, this dotted lines are those temporary partitions which have been done by the algorithm in iteration number 1. So, we can define how many iterations would be required. We can also, when we are doing the second iteration now, you can see the boundary will keep on changing. So, the partition which was done, if I show you the earlier slide, which was almost like a parallel lines, which was a kind of a partition which was very rough partition between the clusters, and now as the iterations going on and it finds out the clusters with the similarity of the pixels value, then you can see that now the line is changing. So, you can see this inclined line. So, the partition is not as per the previous partition, but it keeps on changing. So, boundary will keep on changing between one cluster to another cluster. So, in some cluster there will be less number of pixels, in other clusters there will be a large number of pixels coming into that. So, this actually continues when we are doing the iteration. So, after you have done the iteration and you find that there are clusters which are separated together, which have been identified by the algorithm, then these clusters are to be compared with the ground truth data. So, it is where the human intervention is required, because now you have to decide whether you want to retain those clusters, you want to merge those clusters, or you want to further bifurcate, for example, cluster B. So, we can see that there are group of pixel values at one end, and another end there are group of pixel values. So, is a possibility that there are 2 classes still mixed within the cluster B, and we can separate them out again by changing the parameters, we can have, instead of 2 clusters, we can have 3 clusters from this data set. So, this decision has to be taken by the human being, and that is where the human intervention at the end is required. So, what are these steps? Then you are actually determining a general classification scheme, assigning pixels to the spectral classes, and in ISODATA, which classification, unsupervised classification techniques, we have been doing that. And the third part, assign those spectral classes. Once the software has done its part, then the role of the analyst will come into being, and the spectral classes will be named as these informational classes. Like we can call them class number or cluster number 1 as the forest, cluster number 2 as the agricultural land, cluster number 3 as the water body, cluster number 4 as the urban area, like that. So, we have to convert them into the informational classes. So, if we look at now the one by one steps, determine a general classification scheme. So, it will depend upon the purpose of the classification. So, what is the objective, what is the purpose, what is the application of the classification. So, we cannot actually decide that we want 20 classes from this particular scene, or we want only the 5 classes. So, it would depend upon that ultimately for what purpose we want to determine the classes and at what level we should go. Accordingly, we decide how many number will be there. With unsupervised classification, the scheme does not need to be very specific, because if you give in the beginning 10 clusters and you want only 6 clusters at the end, 6 information classes. So, you can merge them together, you have the option and you have the flexibility of doing that. Now, you are assigning pixels to the spectral classes. So, each group of pixels, when you define the number of classes, then each group of pixels, on the basis of the similar values, they are assigned a relationship in the multidimensional space, and this is called clustering. So, that is why very popularly this unsupervised classification technique is known as the clustering technique, and there is a technique called ISODATA technique, which is very common, very popular technique. It is iterative in nature. We can carry out many iterations till we get the desired results of the accuracy. So, ISODATA full form is iterative self-organizing data analysis technique. So, name itself says that this is a iterative technique, and after each iteration the cluster mean will change, the boundary between the clusters will change. So, the spectral distance actually between the two clusters will keep on changing depending upon the standard deviation value which will define, or the percentage, acceptable percentage which is required. So, here let us say that we have given the number of clusters 10 to 15 desired land use and landcover classes from a particular scene. So, this is the input to the algorithm ISODATA technique, let us say, and then convergence threshold is very important. Next factor is very important in the sense that we have to define that at what threshold level you are going to accept the result. So, percentage of pixels whose class value should not change between the iterations, generally we are setting it to say 95%. So, 5% is acceptable, but 95% class value should not change between the iterations. So, that is what we are defining it, and when we are defining the convergence threshold of 95%, it indicates that the processing will stop as soon as 95% or more pixels from the one iteration has shifted to the next iteration. So, the process will stop and it will take the other pixels into account, and this will continue for number of iterations, and when this convergence threshold is achieved for the entire image, all the clusters, then the process will automatically stop after those iterations. There will not be any change. If you give more number of iteration, then probably you are taking more computational time, but as far as the accuracy of classification is concerned, or the classification of the data is concerned, you are not making any significant contribution to that. Now, in the ISODATA parameters, when we are using this technique, you have to define maximum number of iteration. So, ideally the convergence threshold should be reached by those number of iteration. So, we have to set a reasonable value of the convergence before the iteration is run out. So, this requires merging of the clusters if the separation distance is below the threshold value. So, if it is below the threshold value, it will keep on merging the clusters together, and the rules for splitting a single cluster into the two clusters are also to be defined, or the user at the end can do that. If one single cluster you find that can be broken down into the two clusters, then this is also possible, this is also done. So, as we can see in this particular diagram here, that it is a two band data which has been plotted, and the distribution is a sort of a triangular distribution of the data. And here in this triangular distribution, if we have, let us say, the 5 different clusters where the mean values are shown by the black dots here. So, 5 clusters are to be separated. If we define that plus minus 1 standard deviation in both the bands is acceptable at the beginning and the starting point. In the first iteration, what this will do is that it will make a basically a kind of a ellipse and covering the value of the mean plus the standard deviation. So, mean plus standard deviation it will take and do the partitioning of the data. So, here it is taking the ellipses has been created by 2 sigma values. So, mean plus 2 sigma values, and the 5 clusters have been very well defined, and you can see the ellipse. Now, there is overlap between the data. So, you can see the ellipse are overlapping when the iteration is being done. Then the pixel here in one partition and pixel in the another partition, they are they have the similarity with respect to the clusters value. So, the either the boundary has to be shift or pixel has to be assigned it to the new value. So, this boundary will keep on changing, as you can see also that there are some inclined partitions now, and this will continue, the split and merge process will continue till the desired level of value, the threshold value which has been defined is achieved. So, this split and merge process between the iteration will continue and till the desired value is achieved, and once the desired value is achieved, the program will be terminated and all the iterations will be performed. So, this is what is the entire ISODATA algorithm is doing, and once this has been done, and finally we are getting very 5 distinct clusters, the 5 classes, and now user has to define on the basis of the reference data, on the basis of the ground knowledge of that area, whether the user has to retain those 5 classes or they are to be merged into 4 classes or 3 classes, or they are to be further, some classes are to be further splitted into 2 classes, and each class has to be given a name. So, assign that spectral class to information classes. So, this is where we require ground truth data, we require field data, we require the reference data, or sometimes the classification map, classified map has to be taken to the ground in order to verify which kind of class could be present in the data. So, how that spectral to informational classes is done. So, you can see the cluster of values now here between the 2 bands, one on x axis, another on y axis. The cluster means are plotted, and you can get some kind of a distribution, maybe a triangular distribution, and this is the cluster means plus the standard deviation data, and the ellipse, one can see ellipse and there is some overlap also in the new residential area and the commercial area. But as far as the other are concerned, you can see very well water, wetland, commercial land, forest land, and the old residential land, they are making very distinct kind of clusters together. So one can name actually those clusters on the basis of the information classes. Now this is the example here where we have image which is to be classified using supervised classification approach. So this is the raw data, input data, 3-band data, which is given the input to the classifier by defining the number of iteration, by defining the threshold value, by defining the number of classes which we require at the end, and the program is run. So once we are running that particular program, we are getting something like this classified image. So we have here impervious areas which are the pink shade, the green areas are all vegetated area, and then we have the loose surfaces which are brownish color, and some water pixels are there with the blue color. So this is the kind of a map which we will get after we have assigned the spectral classes into the informational classes. So one has to be very careful while doing so, because this determines ultimately the accuracy of this kind of a map. So this is another example where we have the data, original data with us, and then we have the classification. So we have classified the original data using unsupervised classification into a number of classes which are to be now verified onto the ground as far as the accuracy of the mapping is concerned. This particular technique has some disadvantage. Every technique has some advantage and some disadvantage. So if you are talking of the unsupervised classification technique, the best advantage is that you do not require the prior knowledge about the area, you do not have to collect the reference data, you do not have to spend a lot of time in collecting the training temples which are pure and homogeneous in nature. So straight away you can actually jump to the classification part. Opportunities of the human error are minimized at the beginning, but one has to be very carefully define those informational classes. So unique classes recognized as the distinct unit by the algorithm itself on the basis of the similarity values of the DN. The disadvantage is that you do not know the intermediate results, you come to know only the AND results, and once you have the spectral classes into different clusters, then you have to define them into the informational classes. You have to give the name to the each of the thematic category, and sometimes you find that some clusters are to be further splitted together or merged together. So that is the disadvantage that increases the work. So you have a limited control over the classes and the iterations. Once you have defined it, then once the process is completed, only then you come to know its output. So these are some of the limitations, but to summarize, it is a machine learning technique because it is the iterative procedure. So on the basis of the first iteration, it will take the input to the second one. So it's a machine learning kind of a technique. There is no need to no need to have the analyst in order to carry out the classification. So machine itself will take the judgment and take the decision on the basis of the defined parameters by the analyst. It helps us to find out the all kinds of the unknown patterns in the data. So these unknown patterns are determined by this unsupervised classification technique on the basis of the DN values, similar DN values which are present in the data. Now clustering and association, these are the two basic steps which are present in the unsupervised learning. This algorithm are used against the data which is not labeled. You do not label in the beginning, you do not know about the area, you simply start the classification. But the biggest drawback of this unsupervised classification technique is that you can't get very precise information regarding the data sorting. So these are some of the salient points of unsupervised classification method. So, we have to be careful when we are having the data and we want to classify the data, whether we should go for a supervised classification technique or we should go for unsupervised classification technique based on our knowledge information. Thank you very much. This is all.